September 20th, 1944. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost and approximately 600 British paratroopers have held the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge for 3 days and nights against continuous German assault. They're surrounded, out of ammunition, low on medical supplies, and cut off from all reinforcement. A German officer approaches under a white flag with a surrender demand. Frost reads the ultimatum, looks at his exhausted men fighting from burning buildings, and gives an answer that would echo through military history. Today, we're revealing exactly what Frost said when the Germans offered him a way out, and why both sides remember his response with respect. The evening of September 17, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John Dutton Frost, commanding officer of the 2nd Parachute Battalion, 1st British Airborne Division, led his men through the streets of Arnhem with a single objective: seize the bridge over the lower Rhine and hold it until 30 Corps arrived with armored relief. Intelligence predicted they'd hold for 48 hours maximum. Relief was supposedly guaranteed. Frost was 31 years old, a veteran of airborne operations in North Africa and Italy, and one of Britain's most experienced paratrooper commanders. He was known for aggressive tactics, personal courage, and the ability to inspire absolute loyalty from his men. His battalion had trained for months for this operation. They knew their objective, they knew the stakes, and they believed in their commander completely. The approach to the bridge was supposed to be contested by demoralized German garrison troops. Instead, Frost's battalion encountered increasing resistance as they advanced along the river road toward their objective. German blocking positions slowed their progress. Confused street fighting erupted in Arnhem's suburbs. Other British battalions, taking different routes, encountered even heavier resistance and were stopped miles from the bridge. By nightfall on September 17th, only Frost's battalion had reached the objective. 600 men from the 2nd Parachute Battalion, along with elements of support units and engineers, seized the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge in a textbook airborne assault. They cleared German positions, established defensive perimeters in the brick buildings overlooking the bridge approach, and prepared to hold. But they couldn't capture the southern end. German forces held strong positions on the far side of the Rhine, preventing British paratroopers from securing the entire bridge. Frost's men controlled the northern approach, the Germans held the south, and the massive steel bridge between them became no man's land. Frost established his headquarters in a house directly overlooking the bridge ramp. From his position, he could observe the entire northern approach, direct his battalion's defensive positions, and coordinate what limited communications still functioned with the rest of the division. The 2nd Battalion's deployment was professional. Machine guns covered all approaches, anti-tank weapons positioned to engage armored vehicles, snipers placed in upper floors, and reserve troops held in cellars, ready to respond to German breakthroughs. The plan was simple: hold the bridge until 30 Corps arrived. 48 hours, 2 days. Any British paratrooper could hold any position for 2 days. It was what they trained for, what they excelled at, what defined airborne infantry doctrine. Hold the objective, wait for relief, mission accomplished. What Frost didn't know was that Field Marshal Model had already begun organizing a response that would turn those 48 hours into 9 days of hell. And what the Germans didn't know was that they were about to face British paratroopers who would redefine what holding to the last actually meant. The stage was set for one of World War II's most dramatic small unit actions. A single battalion, isolated miles behind enemy lines, holding a strategic objective against an entire German army. It was the kind of situation military planners described as tactically impossible. Frost was about to prove them wrong. September 18th, dawn. The first German probe came just after sunrise. A small convoy of trucks carrying SS Panzer Grenadiers approached the bridge from the north, apparently unaware that British paratroopers had seized the position overnight. Frost's men held their fire until the Germans were completely exposed on the bridge approach. Then the ambush erupted. British machine guns, anti-tank weapons, and rifles opened fire simultaneously from multiple positions. The German trucks were shredded, vehicles exploded, men fell. Within seconds, the entire convoy was destroyed, burning wreckage blocking the northern approach to the bridge. The Germans retreated in disorder, leaving their dead and wounded behind. It was a perfect defensive engagement. Exactly the kind of action British paratroopers trained for, but it also announced to every German unit in the area that the bridge was held by professional soldiers who knew exactly what they were doing. From that moment forward, the Germans understood this would not be an easy objective to recapture. Throughout September 18th, German attacks increased in intensity. SS reconnaissance units probed British positions, testing for weaknesses. Snipers engaged British paratroopers from distant buildings. German artillery began ranging in on the houses where Frost's men had established their defense. Each attack was repelled, but each attack also cost British casualties and consumed precious ammunition. Frost moved through his positions constantly, checking on his men, directing defensive fires, maintaining morale. His presence was steady, confident, almost casual under fire. Men who fought at Arnhem later recalled that Frost seemed completely unworried, as if holding a bridge against an entire German army was just another day's work. If the colonel wasn't concerned, then the situation must be manageable. But Frost was very concerned. Communication with the rest of the division had almost completely failed. Radio sets that worked perfectly in England were failing in Arnhem, possibly due to urban interference or damage during the drop. Frost couldn't contact division headquarters. He couldn't coordinate with other battalions. He had no clear picture of the overall tactical situation. All he knew was this: no other British forces had reached the bridge, and 30 Corps had not arrived. On the evening of September 18th, Frost gathered his company commanders for a brief conference in his headquarters building. According to multiple witnesses, including Major Douglas Crawley, the battalion's second-in-command, Frost addressed the situation directly. "Gentlemen, we've received no communication from division. We don't know where the rest of the brigade is. We haven't heard armor, but we have our orders. Hold this bridge. So that's what we're going to do. We'll hold until 30 Corps arrives, however long that takes." One of the company commanders asked the obvious question: what if 30 Corps doesn't arrive? Frost's response, recorded in multiple post-war accounts, was characteristically direct. "Then we'll hold until we run out of ammunition, and then we'll hold with bayonets. This bridge is the objective. We took it. Nobody is taking it back." The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. The officers returned to their positions, and the siege continued. September 19th. The German attacks escalated from probes to full-scale assaults. SS Hauptsturmführer Viktor Gräbner, commanding a reconnaissance battalion from the 9th SS Panzer Division, received orders to break through British positions and cross the bridge at all costs. His battalion included armored cars, half-tracks, and infantry. It was a powerful force on paper. At approximately 9:30 in the morning, Gräbner's battalion launched a direct assault up the bridge approach. Armored vehicles roared toward British positions, hoping to overwhelm the defenders through speed and firepower. It was an aggressive tactic, almost desperate, and it was a catastrophic mistake. British anti-tank weapons waited until the German vehicles were at point-blank range. Then they opened fire. The lead armored cars exploded. Vehicles behind crashed into the wreckage. Half-tracks burned. German infantry dismounted directly into a kill zone where British machine guns cut them down. The bridge approach became a slaughter ground. Gräbner himself was killed in the assault. His battalion was virtually destroyed. Burning vehicles littered the bridge, creating a barrier that blocked further German attempts to rush the position. It was a devastating German defeat, and it proved that frontal assault against prepared British positions was futile. But the victory came at a cost. British ammunition stocks, already limited, dropped significantly. Casualties mounted, and the Germans learned a critical lesson. They couldn't take the bridge by direct assault. They would have to destroy the British positions systematically, building by building, room by room. The Germans changed tactics. Artillery and mortar fire pounded British positions constantly. The brick buildings that sheltered British paratroopers became death traps as shells collapsed walls and ceilings. German snipers engaged any British soldier who showed himself, and critically, the Germans brought up tanks and self-propelled guns to fire directly into British-held buildings at ranges measured in yards. The character of the battle changed. It was no longer maneuver and assault. It became siege warfare, urban combat at its most brutal. German forces surrounded Frost's perimeter, cutting off any possibility of reinforcement or withdrawal. They compressed the British positions, pushing the paratroopers into an ever smaller area. Buildings burned, rubble blocked streets. Quietly, the wounded accumulated in cellars, with insufficient medical supplies and no way to evacuate them. Throughout this intensifying hell, Frost remained visible to his men. Captain Anthony Frank, commanding one of the rifle companies, later wrote, "The colonel was everywhere. When a position was under heavy attack, he would appear, assess the situation, give orders in that calm voice of his, and move on. We were exhausted, terrified, in watching our mates die around us. But if Colonel Frost said we'd hold, then by God, we'd hold." But what Frost couldn't tell his men was that hope for relief was fading. By the evening of September 19th, it was clear that 30 Corps hadn't reached Arnhem on schedule. The rest of the division was pinned down miles away, unable to reach the bridge. The 2nd Battalion was alone, and they would remain alone. September 20th, dawn. The British perimeter had contracted to just a few blocks around the bridge. German pressure was unrelenting. SS assault teams advanced building by building, clearing British positions through vicious close-quarters combat. Grenades exploded in stairwells. Men fought room to room with rifles, pistols, and bayonets. The line between front and rear disappeared. Everywhere was the front. Ammunition became critical. Frost ordered strict fire discipline. Every shot had to count. Machine gunners rationed bursts to absolute necessity. Rifle ammunition was pooled and redistributed to forward positions. Anti-tank weapons saved their last rounds for the inevitable final German assault. The battalion was fighting on fumes and determination. Medical facilities, such as they were, collapsed under the strain. The battalion's medical officer, Captain James Logan, worked in a cellar with minimal supplies. Wounded men lay shoulder to shoulder on the floor. Morphine ran out. Bandages were improvised from torn uniforms. Surgery was performed by candlelight without anesthesia. Men died from wounds that would have been survivable with proper medical care. Logan later estimated he treated over 200 casualties in conditions he described as medieval. On the morning of September 20th, a German assault team broke into the ground floor of Frost's headquarters building. British paratroopers fought them on the stairs, in the hallways, room by room. Grenades and small arms fire echoed through the building. Frost himself grabbed a Sten gun and joined the hiding, directing the defense while engaging German soldiers at close range. The assault was repelled, but the headquarters building was no longer secure. German forces held the ground floor, British paratroopers held the upper floors. The two sides fought vertically within the same structure. The situation was beyond desperate. It was functionally impossible. and yet the 2nd Battalion continued fighting. Years later, historians and military analysts would struggle to explain why. The rational decision would have been to surrender. The men were surrounded, outnumbered, out of supplies, and without hope of relief. Continuing to fight only meant more casualties for no strategic gain. But rationality had stopped being relevant somewhere around September 18th. This was no longer about strategy or objectives or relief columns. This had become something more fundamental, a test of pure will. The Germans were determined to take the bridge. Frost's battalion was determined not to give it to them. Everything else was secondary. German commanders recognized what they were facing. This wasn't normal combat. This was something different, something that transcended tactical logic. The British weren't fighting to achieve an objective anymore. They were fighting because they were British paratroopers. And British paratroopers didn't surrender while they could still hold a trigger. The full impact of Frost's refusal didn't become clear until after the war. When German accounts of the battle emerged, the extraordinary respect both sides developed for each other became apparent. SS Brigade Führer Heinz Harmel, commanding the 10th SS Panzer Division at Arnhem, was interviewed extensively by British historians in the 1950s and 60s. His account of the surrender demand and Frost's response revealed the German perspective. When our officer returned and reported that the British commander had refused surrender, Harmel recalled, "There was a moment of silence in our headquarters. Then someone said, 'Of course he refused. They're British Fallschirmjäger. What did we expect? We had thrown everything at those paratroopers for 3 days. We had tanks, artillery, overwhelming numbers. They had small arms and determination, and they would not yield.'" Harmel continued, "I ordered the final assault with genuine regret. These were brave men fighting a hopeless battle with honor and skill. They deserved better than what we were about to do to them. But they had refused surrender, so we had no choice. That evening I told my staff, whatever happens tomorrow, remember that we fought against soldiers who showed us what courage actually means. Treat them with the respect they've earned." The final assault came on September 21st. German tanks fired directly into British positions at point-blank range. Buildings collapsed. Fire consumed entire blocks. Ammunition exhausted, the British fought with grenades, bayonets, and bare hands, room by room, floor by floor. The Germans cleared the remaining positions. Lieutenant Colonel Frost was severely wounded by a mortar shell on September 20th. With both legs injured and unable to walk, he continued commanding from a cellar until loss of blood rendered him unconscious. Major Douglas Crawley assumed command of the remnants of the battalion. On the morning of September 21st, when the last defensive position became untenable, Crawley ordered the survivors to attempt breakout or surrender individually. Organized resistance was no longer possible. Approximately 100 men from the original 600 were captured unwounded. Over 200 were wounded and captured. The rest were killed. The 2nd Parachute Battalion had been virtually annihilated. But they had held the bridge for 4 days and 3 nights against overwhelming odds. Not the 48 hours they expected. 96 hours of continuous combat. Frost, evacuated to a German military hospital, was visited by German officers who expressed genuine respect for his battalion's stand. According to Frost's own memoir, A Drop Too Many, published in 1980, one German officer told him, "Colonel, I commanded troops in Russia, in France, in Poland. I have fought many enemies, but I have never witnessed defensive action as determined as your battalions. You held with no hope, no relief, no possibility of victory. You held because you were ordered to hold. That is soldiering at the highest level. It was an honor to fight against you, even though we had to destroy you to prevail." The German doctor treating Frost reportedly said, "Your wound may save your life, Colonel. If you had not been injured, you would have fought until we killed you. Your men were the same. They fought until we killed them or they collapsed from wounds. I have treated German paratroopers. They fight this way. I have not seen other armies fight this way. You were very brave, also very foolish, but mostly very brave." Field Marshal Model himself, according to post-war German accounts, asked for a report on the British defense at the bridge. When informed that a single British battalion had held for 4 days against an entire SS Panzer division's worth of forces, Model reportedly said, "That is the difference between professional soldiers and garrison troops. The British paratroopers at the bridge were professionals. We must ensure our after-action reports accurately reflect that we defeated elite troops fighting at their maximum capability, not inferior forces. There is no shame in taking 4 days to destroy them. There would be shame in failing to recognize their achievement." Perhaps the most moving testimony came from SS Hauptsturmführer Hans Moeller, who led one of the final assault teams that cleared the British positions. In a 1963 interview, Moeller said, "We entered the last building they held, expecting fanatic last stands. What we found were exhausted men, many wounded, completely out of ammunition, who still tried to resist with bayonets and rifle butts. We ordered them to surrender. One man, a captain I think, said to us, 'We're British paratroopers. We don't surrender. You'll have to put us down.' He was bleeding from multiple wounds. He could barely stand, but he meant every word." Moeller continued, "We did not shoot them. We forced them to surrender by physically restraining them. These were warriors who had exceeded the limits of human endurance. To kill them at that point would have dishonored us, not them." British accounts confirmed the extraordinary nature of the stand. Major General Roy Urquhart, commanding the 1st Airborne Division, wrote in his memoir, "When I finally learned what Frost and the 2nd Battalion had accomplished, I was simultaneously filled with pride and grief. They had done everything we asked and more. They held far longer than planned, against impossible odds, with no support. Frost's refusal to surrender when offered terms was characteristic of the man and the battalion. They were airborne soldiers. Surrender wasn't in their vocabulary." Montgomery himself, in a confidential memo written shortly after Martin Garden, stated, "The failure of Martin Garden cannot be laid at the feet of the airborne forces. The 2nd Parachute Battalion's action at Arnhem Bridge represents courage and determination of the highest order. Colonel Frost and his men achieved their objective and held it beyond any reasonable expectation. That they were ultimately overwhelmed does not diminish their achievement. They proved that British airborne forces are second to none." Lieutenant Colonel John Frost spent the rest of the war in German prisoner of war camps. He was repatriated in May 1945 and continued his military career, eventually retiring as a major general. He never spoke extensively about Arnhem during his life. He considered the battle a military failure, despite the tactical achievement. In his memoir, he wrote simply, "We were ordered to take the bridge and hold it. We did." That the operation failed overall was not due to lack of effort by the men who fought at the bridge. The 2nd Paratrooper Battalion was reconstituted after the war, carrying forward the battle honors from Arnhem. The unit's motto became Utrinque Paratus, ready for anything. The battle at Arnhem Bridge became the defining moment in the battalion's history, studied by every soldier who served in it thereafter. The bridge itself was rebuilt after the war and renamed the John Frost Bridge in 1977, honoring the commander who held it against impossible odds. A memorial near the northern end commemorates the paratroopers who fought there. Every year, on September 17th, Veterans, families, and Dutch citizens gather at the bridge to remember the battle and honor those who fell. The German officers who fought at Arnhem maintained lifelong respect for the British paratroopers. In the 1970s and 80s, several reunions were held where British and German veterans of the battle met, shared memories, and acknowledged each other's courage. These meetings were marked with mutual respect and recognition that both sides had fought honorably in desperate circumstances. The tactical lessons from Arnhem were studied extensively by militaries worldwide. The defense demonstrated what determined infantry could achieve against armored forces in urban terrain. It showed that morale and leadership could sustain troops far beyond normal breaking points, and it proved that sometimes military achievement is measured not by victory, but how forces conduct themselves in defeat. Frost's refusal to surrender became emblematic of British airborne spirit. It wasn't bravado, it wasn't false heroics, it was simple, professional determination. They had orders, they would execute those orders, and surrender wasn't part of the mission. That ethos defined British airborne forces throughout the war and continued to define them in subsequent conflicts. The strategic failure of Market Garden meant that the 2nd Battalion's sacrifice didn't shorten the war or achieve operational objectives. But military history remembers Arnhem not as a failure of courage or determination, but as a failure of planning and intelligence. The men who fought at the bridge did everything asked of them, and more. They wrote a chapter in military history that both sides remember with respect. In 1969, the film A Bridge Too Far brought the battle to popular attention. The film depicted Frost's stand at the bridge and his refusal to surrender, introducing a new generation to the story. While Hollywood took liberties with details, the core truth remained. A single battalion held a bridge for 4 days against an entire German army, refusing surrender even when the situation became hopeless. That's not just military history, that's the definition of duty. The Battle of Arnhem contains countless stories of individual courage and determination. Next time, we'll reveal what German doctors said when treating wounded British paratroopers after the battle, and how their accounts revealed the extraordinary respect that developed between enemies who fought each other to the limits of human endurance. Do you think Frost made the right decision refusing surrender? Could his men have been saved if he'd accepted terms? Or was continuing the fight essential to military honor regardless of outcome? Share your perspective in the comments. If you want to explore more stories where soldiers faced impossible choices and defined themselves through how they responded, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We're examining the moments that reveal human character under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Thank you for watching.